I don't want some black woman touching me. Get me a real doctor." That's what she said, loud, in public, with her chin high, like she expected the room to agree. Everyone heard it. No one stopped her. What she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the woman she just humiliated, she wasn't a nurse. She wasn't a janitor. She was the only person in that building who could keep her alive. This story doesn't start with kindness. It starts with arrogance. With a white woman who believed her money and her skin gave her the right to decide who mattered. It starts with a hospital too afraid to challenge her, and a room full of professionals who stood still while a black doctor was pushed aside. But what comes next? That's not what she saw coming. Because when the line between life and death appeared, the only person who stepped forward was the same black woman she tried to erase. And what she did in that moment didn't just save a life. It exposed everything this system tries to hide. This is not just a story. It's a reckoning. So if you're ready for the full truth, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what would you have done if you were in her shoes? The private hospital lobby was designed to impress. High ceilings, velvet seating, and the sterile gleam of money well spent. Helen Whitmore, dressed in a designer coat and oversized sunglasses, strutted in like she owned the building. Her heels clicked against the polished marble as she clutched her purse tightly to her chest, scanning the room with thinly veiled disdain. She was here for a vascular consultation, something discreet and high-end, and she expected nothing less than perfection. As she turned the corner toward the VIP waiting area, her eyes locked onto a black woman seated alone on the cream leather bench. The woman was reading a tablet, posture impeccable, wearing tailored navy blue slacks and a simple blouse. No name tag, no stethoscope, nothing that screamed authority, just presence. Too much of it. Helen's mouth twisted into a thin line as she approached. Without hesitation, she raised her voice, loud enough for every receptionist, patient, and staff member within earshot to hear. "Excuse me," she snapped, waving dismissively at the woman. "I don't need the floors mopped right now. Can someone get her out of here?" The woman looked up, her expression calm and unreadable. She didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The silence itself said enough. As she slowly rose to her feet, Helen rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath, "God, even cleaning staff think they can loiter anywhere now." The woman opened her mouth, clearly about to speak. "Actually, ma'am," but Helen cut her off with a sharp flick of the wrist, as if swatting away a fly. No, please," she said, her voice coated in condescension. "I don't need explanations. I need a doctor. A real one. Go get whoever's actually in charge." At the front desk, a receptionist shifted uncomfortably in her seat, lips parting as if to say something, then closing again. The room had gone still. The woman facing Helen, though, didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head slightly, studying the older woman with a kind of analytical patience that made Helen feel like the one under examination. "You requested Dr. Brooks, correct?" the woman said quietly. Helen nodded sharply. "Yes. I assume she'll be out soon. I don't have time for this nonsense." The woman gave a faint, knowing smile, one that never reached her eyes. "Then let's begin," she said, gesturing toward the hall. "I'm Dr. Maya Brooks." Helen froze, her manicured fingers curling slightly around the strap of her purse. For a brief moment, the words didn't register. Then they did. Her face twisted, not in apology, but in alarm. "You the doctor?" she asked, half choking on the words. "You." Maya nodded once, expression unreadable. "Would you like to proceed with the consult, Mrs. Whitmore, or should we reschedule with someone else?" Helen's mouth opened, then closed again. She turned toward the receptionist as if looking for an escape, but no lifeline came. The receptionist simply glanced away, embarrassed. Every person in the waiting area had heard, had watched. Helen swallowed hard. "Fine," she muttered, brushing past Maya like a gust of misplaced superiority. "Let's just get this over with." As they walked down the corridor toward the consultation rooms, Maya kept her steps even, her shoulders square, her expression cool and composed. Behind her, Helen's eyes darted from one expensive painting to the next, anything to avoid acknowledging the humiliation she had just inflicted, and the growing realization that this woman, this person she had so effortlessly insulted, held her health in her hands. And yet, even now, she refused to feel shame. In Helen's mind, she had been tricked, misled. Hospitals should label their doctors more clearly. Why wasn't Maya wearing a white coat? Why wasn't she announced? Why wasn't she different? But none of that mattered now. Not really. What mattered was that Maya walked with quiet authority, the kind that didn't ask for permission and didn't need approval. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Helen followed, reluctantly, resentfully, but undeniably, down a hall lined with accolades and framed research publications. Some of the names were familiar. One, near the end of the hallway, stood out in clean, bold letters. Dr. Maya E. Brooks, MD, Chief of Vascular Surgery. Helen paused briefly, her eyes narrowing. "Nice decoration," she murmured sarcastically, masking her discomfort. "I guess everyone gets a trophy these days." Maya didn't respond. She simply opened the door to exam room 4 and stepped inside. Helen lingered for a second, her hand hovering near the doorknob, as if some invisible weight pressed against it. Then, with a deep breath that sounded more like a scoff, she followed. Inside, the room was immaculate, modern, sleek, with a digital display already showing her scan results. Maya moved with practiced efficiency, setting her tablet down and preparing her notes. Helen watched her, arms crossed, tapping her heel against the floor, trying to reassert control. But inside, something had shifted. This wasn't the encounter she expected, and this certainly wasn't the woman she thought she'd be dealing with. Yet, still, she couldn't stop the contempt from rising. She wouldn't apologize. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because in Helen's world, people like Maya didn't belong in positions of power. They didn't get to walk through executive wings without permission. They didn't get to correct her. But for now, Helen had no choice but to sit down and be examined by the woman she had just tried to dismiss. A woman who hadn't raised her voice, hadn't defended herself with anger, and yet had won the first round of this quiet war with nothing more than composure. Gr. Maya Brooks walked ahead with quiet confidence, clipboard in hand, her heels tapping steadily against the polished tile. Behind her, Helen Whitmore followed with reluctant steps, her expression pinched and disapproving. After the moment in the waiting room, Helen had convinced herself she'd been caught off guard, nothing more, but the discomfort festered, twisting into something sharper and meaner with each step. She narrowed her eyes, allowing them to trace the doctor's figure from behind, slowly scanning from Maya's sensible low heels to her neatly tied bun. Helen's lips curled into a smirk, and with a chuckle low enough to sound dismissive, she muttered just loud enough for Maya to hear. "It's a shame, really. A place this expensive used to be more selective. Standards must have dropped lately." Maya didn't stop walking. Her back remained straight, her pace unchanged, but her grip around the clipboard tightened slightly. She said nothing, because she knew people like Helen didn't deserve responses. They deserved consequences. Helen took Maya's silence as weakness, which only emboldened her. She stepped faster to walk beside her and added, "You know, I don't blame you. Everyone's trying to climb up these days. Can't fault ambition, even if it's a bit misplaced." Maya finally glanced sideways, her eyes calm but steely. "My qualifications are not up for discussion, Mrs. Whitmore. Let's focus on your medical condition, shall we?" Helen scoffed, waving a dismissive hand again, as if Maya were a persistent housefly buzzing around her luxury. "Of course. You do your whatever it is you do. Just don't expect me to be impressed." The two women reached the exam suite, a private room set up like a boutique clinic, tasteful, efficient, and custom designed for high-profile patients. Maya opened the door, held it for Helen, and gestured for her to enter first. Helen paused at the threshold, her eyes darting across the room, then landed back on Maya with suspicion hardening her face. "Wait," she said, her voice suddenly loud, sharp enough to draw attention from a nurse at the end of the hall. "I'm sorry, but I can't go in there with her." Maya's brows lifted slightly, more from habit than surprise. Is there a problem? She asked, her tone still steady. Helen turned fully to face her now, stepping back away from the door like it had suddenly become radioactive. I don't want to be touched. Not by you. I don't feel comfortable. You understand, don't you? There are certain lines I don't cross. Maya stood completely still, her expression composed, unflinching. I am your assigned physician. You were referred directly to me by the hospital's chief. If you wish to request a reassignment, I'll notify administration, but that will delay your consultation indefinitely. Helen folded her arms, her voice rising a notch. No, I want my exam. I just don't want it from you. Surely there's someone else, someone more appropriate for a case like mine. Maya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she didn't respond to the bait. Instead, she turned slightly and opened a drawer by the wall, retrieving a pair of examination gloves and a diagnostic tablet. I am more than qualified to handle vascular anomalies, Mrs. Whitmore, she said, her tone laced with cool professionalism. And as it stands, I'm the only one available at your level of care. Helen took a hesitant step into the room, her discomfort radiating off her like perfume, but she refused to sit. I just don't see why I should lower my standards for the sake of hospital politics, she said bitterly. You may be smart, sure, but smart doesn't mean right. Maya didn't respond. She was used to patients like Helen, people who didn't want healing, just power. She tapped a few notes onto her tablet and moved toward the monitor. Have a seat, Mrs. Whitmore. The sooner we begin, the sooner this can be over. Helen finally sat, but not without muttering. Trust me, no one wants it over more than I do. As Maya began reviewing the scans, Helen stared straight ahead, arms crossed, her eyes avoiding every surface that might reflect the face of the woman she'd just insulted. Again. There was tension in the room now, not the nervous kind, but the kind born of centuries of judgment and bias compacted into two people forced to occupy the same space. Maya moved with silent efficiency, her fingers gliding across the screen, her voice calm as she explained each segment of the test. Helen didn't listen. Not really. She nodded vaguely but remained in that toxic fog of her own indignation, waiting for the moment she could leave and complain to someone who'd understand. The door closed with a muted click as Helen left the exam room, her heels striking the hallway floor harder than necessary, echoing down the corridor like defiance. Maya remained inside, calmly sanitizing the instruments and returning the gloves to the disposal unit. Her hands were steady, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of frustration, not at the insult itself, but at the system that made room for it. The encounter had played out exactly as she expected, right down to Helen's refusal to be touched. She'd seen it before, heard it in different forms, in different accents, from patients with all kinds of pedigrees who thought a white coat belonged to a specific kind of person. Yet it wasn't Helen's racism that lingered in Maya's mind as she finished her notes. It was the indifference of the institution that would likely do what they always did, bend toward money, not merit. 10 minutes later, her hunch proved correct. There was a knock at her office door, not hesitant, but official, followed by the entrance of Dr. Lowell, the hospital's associate director. He was in his 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, a man who prided himself on diplomacy over conflict. Maya, he said with a warm professionalism that only made her guard go up. Do you have a moment? Maya closed the file she'd just finalized and gave a small nod. Of course. He stepped in, closed the door, and stood with both hands clasped behind his back, always the image of poised authority. I just spoke with Mrs. Whitmore, he began. She's concerned. She feels the dynamic of her care isn't ideal. Maya leaned back in her chair slightly, her expression unreadable. She refused examination and implied she'd only accept treatment from someone more appropriate. Dr. Lowell cleared his throat uncomfortably. Yes, that word came up, more than once. Maya waited. She'd learned not to fill silences in these meetings. She made them do the work. Finally, he sighed. She's threatened legal action, claims discrimination, oddly enough, suggesting we're forcing physician assignments based on quotas. Naturally, it's baseless, but we can't afford the noise right now. The board is in the middle of a merger proposal. Maya's jaw remained relaxed, but her eyes had hardened. "So what exactly are you asking me to do?" Dr. Lowell gave a rehearsed smile, the kind meant to smooth over bad policy decisions. "Just for this case, perhaps you can step back. Provide support from a side, maybe observe while Dr. Chun takes the lead." He's already agreed. Maya stared at him, silent. He shifted slightly under her gaze. "You'll still be part of the treatment team," he added. "But optics matter. If we can calm her down now, maybe she'll finish the treatment cycle quietly." Maya didn't flinch, didn't look away. Her voice, when it came, was calm as glass. "So we reward the bigot and silence the person qualified to save her life." Dr. Lowell's smile faded slightly. "It's not about rewarding anyone. It's about avoiding escalation. I'm asking you, as a colleague and a friend, to help us de-escalate this one." Maya stood slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. "Understood. I'll step back. But I won't pretend this is anything but what it is." She didn't wait for a reply. She gathered her tablet, took her notes, and exited the office with the same poise she'd entered it with this morning. Later that afternoon, Helen returned to the VIP wing, smugness oozing from every movement. She wore a new scarf, fresh makeup, and the self-satisfaction of someone who had gotten exactly what they wanted. As the nurse escorted her to the room, Helen noticed Maya walking down the opposite hall, a folder tucked under one arm, eyes ahead. Their paths crossed briefly, and Helen stopped just long enough to ensure her words were heard. "Glad to see you found your place," she said, voice dripping with mockery. "Support staff suits you." Maya didn't respond. She didn't even blink. She kept walking, and that silence hit harder than any comeback. Helen turned back to the nurse, chuckling under her breath. "Some people need to be reminded," she whispered, loud enough to be heard. "Not everyone gets to pretend forever." Later that day, Helen sat reclined in one of the private diagnostic suites, her legs crossed and arms loosely folded over her abdomen as she waited for the scan technician to finish prepping the machine. The lights had been dimmed to optimize screen contrast, but the shadows did little to soften the sour curl of her lips or the irritation flickering in her eyes. A nurse adjusted the settings beside her, tapping gently on the monitor and speaking with the kind of professional detachment that came from years of dealing with high-maintenance patients. Helen barely acknowledged her presence. Instead, she kept stealing glances through the small observation window, where Dr. Maya Brooks stood with her arms crossed, silently reviewing Helen's file from behind the glass. Though she said nothing and remained outside the room as requested, Maya's presence alone seemed to provoke Helen. She leaned slightly toward the nurse, her voice low but unmistakably bitter. "You know," she said, "I buried my husband last year. 42 years of marriage. He was a general surgeon, prestigious, respected. People like him build hospitals like this." The nurse nodded politely, not entirely sure what response was expected. Helen smirked, clearly not finished. "And now," she continued, her eyes drifting back to the window where Maya stood, "this is what I get. A woman who probably got her degree by filling some diversity quota. A doctor who thinks being competent means just showing up with the right skin color." The nurse stiffened slightly, keeping her face neutral. Helen caught the reaction and leaned back in satisfaction. "Don't get me wrong," she added with mock sweetness. "I'm all for people lifting themselves up, just not at the expense of quality or tradition." Outside the glass, Maya remained perfectly still. She couldn't hear Helen's exact words, but she'd seen enough lips curl, enough eyes roll, enough jaws clench over the years to know the tone by instinct alone. There was something uniquely poisonous about Helen's brand of entitlement, disguised as grief, delivered as venom. Inside the suite, the technician began positioning the scanning wand along Helen's abdomen, asking her to inhale and exhale in intervals. Helen complied, but her attention remained fixed on the observation window. After a few moments, the technician stepped out to calibrate results, leaving Helen alone with the nurse. Maya, still observing silently from behind the glass, tapped a note on the tablet and began walking away, moving toward the physician's hub for case review. But Helen noticed the motion and sat up slightly, her voice rising in pitch and volume, sharp enough to cut through the room. "Oh, are you still here?" she said with theatrical surprise, locking eyes with Maya through the glass. "I thought support staff knew when they weren't needed anymore." The nurse looked up sharply, stunned into stillness. Maya, already halfway down the corridor, paused only for a second. She didn't turn around, didn't offer a glance, but the air shifted. Everyone in the hallway felt it. Helen chuckled, emboldened by the silence. "Honestly, I thought she'd be gone by now," she said aloud. "The air smells cleaner when she's not in it." The words didn't echo. They landed flat but heavy, sinking into the walls like stains that couldn't be scrubbed out. Inside the diagnostic suite, the nurse's mouth tightened into a thin line. She looked down at the chart in her hands and then directly at Helen. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly, her voice carefully measured, "Dr. Brooks has been leading our vascular team for 6 years. She's performed more successful bypasses and aneurysm resections than anyone else on staff. You may not like her, but I would trust her with my life." Helen blinked, caught off guard, her smug expression faltering for just a moment before hardening again. "I'm not asking you to trust her with yours," she said coldly. "I'm saying I won't trust her with mine." Outside, Maya entered the case review lounge and sank into a chair, finally allowing herself a moment of stillness. She didn't need to hear Helen's full comments to understand the weight of what was said. She could feel it in the subtle hush among nurses, the way technicians averted their eyes when passing her, the uncomfortable glances exchanged in hallways. It was always the same, quiet prejudice disguised as preference, bigotry masked as opinion. And the worst part? No one would speak against it, not directly. They would simply reroute, reassess, reassign anything to keep the peace and preserve the donations of patients like Helen Whitmore. The next morning arrived cloaked in sterile quiet, the kind hospitals often wore before a storm of complications. And inside the brightly lit consultation room, Dr. Kevin Tran reviewed Helen Whitmore's chart while sipping burnt coffee from a paper cup. He had been hastily assigned to her case after the previous day's incident, and though his credentials were solid, his experience with vascular anomalies was limited to textbook knowledge and a few well-supervised procedures. He skimmed her ultrasound and CT scans, furrowing his brow, but ultimately landing on the most straightforward explanation: Helen's abdominal discomfort and nausea, paired with mild internal irritation in the scans, looked to him like a classic case of a bleeding gastric ulcer. "We'll schedule an endoscopy for later this afternoon," he told Helen, who lay reclined on the padded exam chair with a smug sense of satisfaction. "Simple procedure, quick and minimally invasive. We'll confirm the diagnosis and begin treatment immediately after." Helen smiled thinly, clearly pleased with herself. "Told you it wasn't anything complicated. Probably stress. I've had a hard year." Kevin gave a polite chuckle and jotted the order into her chart. Outside the room, the nurse who had witnessed yesterday's encounter with Maya typed the prep instructions into the patient management system, but her posture was tight, her fingers hesitant. Something didn't sit right. 2 doors down, Maya stood in front of the radiology board, her tablet in hand, reanalyzing the scans she had flagged the night before. She rotated the 3D render of Helen's abdominal region, zooming in on the left iliac artery, where a slight bulge distorted the vessel wall. It was subtle but not benign. The density and shape were consistent with an early-stage abdominal aortic aneurysm, a silent, deadly condition if missed. Maya tapped into the measurement interface, recorded the dimensions of the dilation, and cross-checked it against clinical markers. The risk wasn't imminent rupture, not yet, but invasive procedures like endoscopy could easily trigger one if pressure was applied to the wrong area. She tapped the screen twice to lock her findings and then turned, walking straight toward the administrator's floor. She knew they wouldn't want to hear from her, not now, not after stepping back, but she also knew what would happen if no one listened. Inside the glass-paneled office of Dr. Lowell, the same man who'd asked her to de-escalate 2 days prior, Maya laid the tablet on the desk between them. "There's a vascular abnormality," she said firmly, her finger pointing at the scan. "It was overlooked. Dr. Tran is preparing her for an upper GI endoscopy that needs to stop immediately. Lowell peered at the screen, brows slightly lifted, but didn't lean in. I trust Dr. Tran's judgment, he said cautiously. He's a strong generalist. You're not on the case anymore, Maya. Maya didn't blink. With respect, this isn't about who's on the case. It's about a clear misdiagnosis that could result in an internal rupture under sedation. She has a small but developing aneurysm. You send her in for endoscopy, and you risk catastrophic bleeding. Lowell's lips thinned as he leaned back in his chair. Do you have confirmation from radiology? Not yet. I'm trying to avoid wasting time. He sighed heavily. Maya, I can't override the chain of care every time someone has a second opinion. You've already been removed from this case to preserve the hospital's neutrality. I won't stir that pot again. Maya stared at him for a long moment. Her voice dropped. This isn't about neutrality. It's about negligence. If she bleeds out because you didn't want to be uncomfortable, what will you tell the board then? Lowell stiffened, clearly offended, but before he could respond, the door opened and a nurse stepped in. Sorry to interrupt, she said quickly, glancing between them. Dr. Tran has already begun the pre-op prep. Ms. Whitmore is in Bay 3. Maya didn't wait for permission. She grabbed her tablet and left the room, walking fast down the hallway, her flats slapping against the tile. She wasn't allowed to treat Helen, but that didn't mean she let her die. In the prep bay, Helen lay in a semi-upright position, and for already secured in her arm as the nurse adjusted the monitor beside her. Dr. Tran stood by the cart reviewing sedation notes. Everything looks good, he said aloud. Vitals are stable. Maya stepped through the curtain just as he reached for the syringe. Stop, she said. Both heads turned. You're about to scope a patient with an aneurysm. That bulge on the iliac isn't an artifact. It's real. Dr. Tran frowned. That wasn't noted in the initial scan. Maya moved to the monitor and pulled up the reference image she had flagged. That's because you didn't measure it. Look. She zoomed in. Tran leaned forward, eyes narrowing. The nurse watched in stunned silence. Helen, drowsy from the light sedative, blinked slowly and looked between them. What's she doing here? She mumbled, her voice thick. Maya didn't respond. Tran straightened up and finally nodded. We'll cancel the endoscopy. I'll order a vascular consult and a contrast scan. Maya nodded once, silent. As she turned to leave, Helen managed a slurred sentence. Trying to make yourself look useful now. An hour later, Helen Whitmore was wheeled into a secondary observation room near the vascular wing, her sedation having mostly worn off, though the drowsiness still clung to her like fog. The aborted endoscopy had been quietly erased from a schedule, replaced with a rushed vascular consult based on Maya's warning. Yet no one dared to reinstate Maya to the case formally, choosing instead to leave her scan notes anonymized, as if the truth of their origin might further disrupt the hospital's delicate politics. Dr. Tran remained the official lead, though visibly rattled. He now stood beside the on-call resident, reviewing the new scan results with a furrowed brow, muttering terms half understood while trying to assemble a plan of action. Meanwhile, Helen lay in bed, arms crossed over her chest, lips pursed in mild annoyance, as she glanced at the sterile ceiling tiles above her. I don't see why we're dragging this out, she grumbled, her voice laced with fatigue and arrogance. It's indigestion. I've had worse after caviar and champagne. The nurse, adjusting her fore, smiled politely without answering. A few feet away, the monitor tracking Helen's vitals began a slow, irregular blip, almost imperceptible at first, like a distant drumbeat. Then it changed. The sound quickened, sharp and arrhythmic. The numbers on the screen blinked red. The line of her heart rhythm dipped and stuttered. Suddenly, Helen's body arched. Her eyes widened, her hands convulsed involuntarily, and her lips parted as she tried, and failed, to speak. An alarm shrieked through the room as the monitor flatlined briefly before restarting with erratic jolts. Code blue. Code blue, the nurse shouted, pressing the emergency button as two other staff rushed in, knocking over a tray of instruments in the process. Helen's body began to shake violently, Her blood pressure plummeted. Sweat broke out across her forehead in thick beads as her skin turned ashen. "DR." Tran ran in, his voice cracking. "What happened? What's her pressure?" 50/30 and falling, the nurse replied. "Heart rate 140 and irregular. She's crashing." Another doctor burst in from the hallway. "Aneurysmal rupture," he shouted. "We didn't catch it early enough. We need to clamp the flow now," someone else yelled. "We don't have time to transfer. She needs surgical intervention, open access." "Who's qualified?" "We don't have anyone on the floor with vascular clearance," a nurse shouted over the chaos. "Where's the attending?" "DR. Tran's not cleared for vascular trauma." "Then get someone who is," a voice screamed, rising above the cacophony. Outside the surgical bay, Maya had just stepped out of the radiology wing when she heard the alarms. 2 orderlies rushed past her with a crash cart, shouting as they barreled down the hall. Her pulse quickened. Her eyes snapped toward the direction of the noise, the same room Helen had been placed in. Without a second thought, she turned on her heel and sprinted toward the code. Inside the bay, the scene was unraveling. Monitors flashed, people shouted, and Helen's body lay limp now, the convulsions replaced with a terrifying stillness. Blood had begun pooling internally, pressing against vital arteries. Every second counted. DR. Tran stood frozen, sweat pouring down his face, hands trembling as he tried to recall the procedural steps he'd only read in textbooks. "I don't know how to access the aorta," he confessed aloud. "We need vascular. Where the hell is vascular?" Then someone finally said it, not with panic, but with exhausted clarity. "Get DR. Brooks." Maya entered the room like a storm cloaked in calm. Her coat was gone, sleeves rolled, hair pulled back in a tight knot. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't waste time with explanations. "Step back," she said, her voice low but commanding. "Now." No one argued. DR. Tran moved aside like a man grateful to surrender. Maya approached the table, her eyes scanning the vitals and the swelling beneath Helen's lower abdomen. "Clamp here," she said to the nurse, pointing directly. "Set the line for cross-clamping. Prep an access kit. We're doing femoral approach, not abdominal. I'm not opening her if I don't have to." "But the resident started." Maya snapped, "Trust me or get out." The room locked into action around her as if someone had finally turned the volume down on chaos. Her hands moved with surgical precision, her eyes sharp as razors, her focus unshakable. The clamp was placed. A temporary stent was pushed through. The bleeding slowed. The rhythm steadied. The heart monitor returned to a regular beat. Helen's body stilled, her chest rising again with slow, labored breaths. Staff members, still catching their breath from the code, glanced between one another, as if silently confirming what had just happened. She had done it. She had walked into a scene on the verge of death and reversed it, not with guesswork, not with hesitation, but with absolute command. DR. Tran stood near the sink, his gloves limp at his sides, his expression blank with a weight of both relief and humiliation. He had witnessed it firsthand. The seamless coordination, the clarity under pressure, the way the chaos bent around her like it knew she had been here before, in worse places, under worse circumstances. And still, she had delivered. Word spread quickly. By the time Maya reached the surgical admin station, a cluster of nurses and residents had already begun whispering. One nurse leaned toward another, her voice low but clear enough to catch. "That was her," she said. "The one from Kandahar, the combat trauma doc. She was field certified before she even turned 30. The other nurse blinked. "I thought that was a rumor." The first shook her head. "No. She operated intense, sometimes without power. People said she could clamp an artery in 60 seconds flat, blindfolded." Across the floor, an anesthesiologist stepped out from the charting bay and paused when he saw Maya. "DR. Brooks," he called, uncertain. "The chief wants to see you in or command." "Now." Maya didn't reply, didn't ask what for. She simply nodded and changed direction. Inside the command room, the air was stiff with expectation. "DR. Lowell," The same man who had asked her days ago to step aside in the name of hospital harmony stood near the central display, flanked by the chief of surgery, Dr. Warren Fielding, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel and a reputation built on decisive leadership. He wasn't known for subtlety or patience. Maya entered, set her tablet down on the nearest counter, and met his gaze without blinking. Fielding didn't speak right away. He looked at Lowell, then back at her, then let out a low exhale. "They tell me you saved her." Maya kept her posture neutral. She had a ruptured iliac aneurysm that was missed. If we'd waited another minute, she'd be in the morgue. Fielding nodded once. "They also tell me you weren't authorized to be in that room." Lowell shifted uncomfortably, as if he wanted to disappear into the floor. Maya didn't flinch. "Authorization didn't save her," she said. "Skill did." Fielding's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. He turned toward the monitor, where Helen's vitals were now steady, if fragile. "We got board members breathing down our necks, and you just blew the lid off this department's liability chain," he muttered. "That being said," he paused, voice lowering, "every single damn person on that floor froze except you." The room went quiet. Then, finally, he said it. "This case is yours now, officially." Lowell's head snapped sideways. "Warren, with all due respect, don't," Fielding interrupted, raising a hand. "I watched the footage. I saw who saved her. We're not gambling with this woman's life to protect anyone's ego." He turned back to Maya. "You lead from here on out. Coordinate the surgical repair, manage post-op, prep the team. Full control. No more games." Maya nodded once. No satisfaction flashed across her face, no triumphant smirk. Only clarity. She hadn't done it to win a battle. She had done it because someone's life was on the line, and that had always been the only reason that mattered. By the time she returned to the prep wing, a few residents stood taller as she passed. A surgical tech nodded respectfully. Even Dr. Tran, still rattled but recovering, looked her way with something that resembled admiration. Maya didn't acknowledge them, not because she didn't notice, but because she didn't need it. In her mind, the only thing that had changed was the hospital finally catching up to what she already knew, that respect earned in silence under pressure was louder than any title. Back inside the surgical suite, as preparations were made for Helen's vascular repair, the nurse beside the anesthesia machine whispered to a med student, "That's the woman who brought down half a Taliban sniper cell with one field kit and a broken 4-pump." The student's eyes widened. "You're kidding." "I'm not," the nurse replied. "Ask the trauma wing. She trained half their team." The operating room was quiet now, not in stillness, but in control. Every instrument was precisely where it needed to be, every gloved hand steady, every eye trained on Maya Brooks as she stood at the head of the surgical table. She moved like someone born to command chaos, fluid, focused, unfaltering. The arterial rupture had been managed, but the real challenge was the delicate repair of the aneurysm and its surrounding tissue. One slip and Helen could bleed out in seconds. Maya didn't allow the weight of that truth to show. She stood with her back straight, posture relaxed but ready, scalpel glinting under the cold surgical lights. "Clamp at zone 2, she instructed. "Retract the peritoneum gently." "Yes, like that. We're going femoral access to secure the proximal end. Then we move up." Her voice remained steady, not raised, yet everyone in the room moved instantly when she spoke. The silence wasn't from fear, it was from trust. Dr. Tran stood across from her, now relegated to assist. He didn't protest. In fact, he looked relieved. The room no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a team with a leader. Maya made a precise incision along the artery line, her gloved hands moving with surgical choreography honed from years in combat medicine and high-pressure trauma centers. Blood began to pulse, then stilled as clamps engaged in unison. "Suction," she said, and the nurse responded without hesitation. She leaned in, double-checked the graft length, and prepared the suture line. Pulses low, but holding. "We've got a window." Her fingers worked quickly, tying off the bleeder, stitching the graft, reinforcing the arterial wall. "Check distal perfusion," she ordered, not taking her eyes off the vessel. A second passed, then the anesthesiologist nodded. Pulse returning to lower extremities. BP climbing, 85 systolic. Maya gave the faintest nod. Her final stitch held. She stood up straight and announced, stabilized. A wave of collective exhale swept the room. A nurse blinked, realizing she'd been holding her breath the entire time. Another whispered, flawless, under her mask. They worked another 40 minutes to secure and close. Throughout it all, Maya never faltered. When the last bandage was taped and vitals confirmed, she removed her gloves, stepped back from the table, and looked down at Helen, still unconscious, tubes in her nose, cheeks pale, chest rising slowly but steadily. Maya didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She simply turned, walked into the scrub room, and began washing the blood from her hands in silence. Her reflection in the mirror stared back, stoic, tired, and unshaken. Behind her, Dr. Fielding stepped in. He said nothing at first, only stood beside her and matched her in quiet. Then he finally said she would have died. No one else on this floor could have saved her. Maya didn't respond. She rinsed her hands one final time, then grabbed a towel. "I know," she said softly, not arrogantly, but as a simple fact. "That's why I didn't wait." Fielding nodded once. "We'll keep her in ICU overnight, then move her to recovery. I want to monitor her myself," Maya added. Fielding didn't argue. "It's your case." 2 hours later, the ICU lights were low, the machines humming softly beside Helen's bed. The woman who had walked into the hospital exuding power now lay completely still, her body fragile and defeated. Her platinum hair, once immaculate, now clung damply to her temples. The lines on her face looked deeper. The lipstick was gone. The pride was quiet, and Maya sat in the corner of the room, silent, reviewing the monitor feed. She hadn't left. She wouldn't. She watched Helen's oxygen levels, heart rate, BP. All of them slowly returning to baseline. Healing didn't discriminate, even if people did. Then Helen stirred. Just a twitch of the fingers at first. Then a quiet groan. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened halfway. Her gaze, dazed and heavy, slowly drifted around the room until it settled on Maya, sitting there, alone, upright, watching. For a second, Helen's eyes widened in confused disbelief. She blinked slowly, as if trying to reconcile two truths at once: that she was alive, and that the woman she had tried to erase from her care was the one who had brought her back. Maya stood, walked calmly to the bedside, and checked the flow. Helen's lips parted slightly. No words came out, not because of the oxygen tube, but because she didn't have any. Maya didn't expect them. She leaned forward, adjusted the monitor slightly, and spoke in a voice even softer than before. "You're okay. Surgery went well. You had a ruptured aneurysm. We stopped the bleeding. You'll recover." Helen's throat moved. Her eyes didn't leave Maya's face. There was no more condescension, no smugness, just something close to fear. Or maybe awe. Maya met her eyes without anger, without pity, just truth. "I was the only one who could have saved you," she said, not boastfully, but as a matter of fact. Helen blinked again. Her pupils trembled. Still no words. Maya placed the chart back into the holder, turned to leave, and said over her shoulder, "Rest now. You'll need your strength." Gr. Maya Brooks had gone from being sidelined for the sake of optics to becoming the very name people now spoke with quiet reverence in every hallway. From receptionists to surgeons, the sentiment was unanimous. Without her, Helen would have died. Maya, however, had no interest in whispers. She sat at her desk in the surgical wing, finalizing Helen's updated care report. Her posture remained upright, composed, her expression unreadable. The events of the last 36 hours had not changed her, but they had changed the institution around her. A knock came at the door, firm but not rushed. She looked up as Dr. Warren Fielding stepped in, not with the usual air of authority, but with something closer to respect. He closed the door quietly and stood for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. "I won't waste your time," he said. "We both know what happened last night." Maya gave a slow nod. remaining silent. Fielding exhaled and continued, his voice softer than usual. If you hadn't acted when you did, this hospital would be arranging a funeral this morning. And if I'm being honest, we would have also buried our credibility. Maya said nothing, only waited. Fielding stepped closer. Then, without drama or reluctance, he lowered his head slightly. Not theatrically, not forced. Just enough to mean something. "Thank you," he said plainly. "You didn't just save a patient. You reminded us who the real professionals are in this building." Maya didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "I didn't do it for her," she said. "I did it because I took an oath." Fielding nodded slowly, then added, "Starting Monday, you're reinstated as lead on all traumovascular crossover cases. Full authority. No more interference. If anyone has a problem with that, they can talk to me." Maya gave a curt nod. "Understood." As Fielding turned to leave, he paused one last time at the door. "You should know," he said, "Mrs. Whitmore is being discharged this afternoon. She requested a private exit, no press, no escort." Maya raised an eyebrow slightly. "No surprise there." Fielding hesitated, then added, "She also requested not to see you." Maya didn't flinch. "Of course not." Later that day, a nurse wheeled Helen through the hospital's private discharge corridor. The woman who had once arrived in high heels, radiating entitlement, now sat in a simple wheelchair, a blanket folded neatly across her lap. Her skin was still pale, her lips devoid of makeup. Her eyes stayed low, never lifting from the floor. Staff members along the hallway glanced up as she passed, but didn't greet her. Some offered curt nods. Most looked away. There was no fanfare, no warm farewells, no one offering to walk her out. She was a name on a chart, a ghost passing through halls where once she had strutted. As the nurse approached the final door leading to the rear exit, Helen whispered, "Please stop here." The nurse gently pressed the brake and stepped aside. Helen sat in silence for a moment, staring down at her hands, twisting the edge of the blanket between her fingers. Then, without lifting her gaze, she said softly, "She saved me." The nurse looked at her, unsure how to respond. Helen continued, barely audible, "I tried to erase her from my care, and she chose to save me anyway." Her voice trembled, but didn't break. "I thought I was powerful, but power doesn't look like what I thought." A week after Helen's silent discharge, the hospital returned to its usual rhythm, yet something within its walls had shifted. Not in the signage, not in the protocols, but in the way staff stood taller when Maya walked past, in how her name was spoken with a quiet certainty that hadn't been there before. In the heart of the conference wing, posters of keynote speakers lined the entry hall of the National Medical Ethics Summit, and at the center of the rotation was a black and white photograph of Dr. Maya Brooks. Beneath it, bold font read, "Session title Duty, Beyond Bias. Leading with skill in the face of prejudice." The auditorium filled slowly, first with students, then with peers, and finally with those who had once only heard of her in passing. Until now, Maya didn't pace behind the curtain or rehearse her opening line in a corner. She sat in silence, reviewing her notes one final time, not because she needed to, but because preparation was part of her discipline. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage not with fanfare, but with focus, and the room fell quiet as the lights dimmed. She didn't begin with statistics or accolades. She began with a story. "Last week," she said, her voice strong but composed, "I saved the life of a woman who spent 3 days trying to make sure I wasn't allowed in her room." A ripple moved through the crowd, a few heads turned. Pens paused mid-note. "She insulted me. Publicly. Repeatedly. She weaponized her influence to push me aside. And yet, when the moment came, when she was dying, and the only hands that could stop the bleeding were mine, she didn't ask if I was qualified. She just needed saving." Maya paused, allowing the weight of the truth to settle. "So I saved her, not because she was kind, not because she deserved it, but because that's what this profession demands. We do not pick and choose whose life is worth more. We treat, we heal, we show up, even when the system doesn't show up for us." A hush followed her words, the kind that didn't ask for applause, only understanding. She continued, describing the ethical cost of silence, the pressure of navigating institutions that often looked away instead of looking inward, the strength required to act with integrity when surrounded by those who benefit from your silence. Justice in medicine, she said, doesn't always come in the form of a courtroom. Sometimes it comes through the quiet defiance of doing your job right when no one wants you there. Sometimes it's in saving a life that once tried to erase yours. The room remained transfixed, not because her words were loud, but because they were true. When she concluded, there was no roar of standing ovation. There didn't need to be. The silence that followed said everything. Later that evening, long after the conference had wrapped, Maya returned to the hospital alone. Not for a shift, not for a consult, just to walk the halls that had held so much conflict and still more resolve. She passed familiar nurses, who smiled without speaking. A janitor nodded once. A resident pretended not to stare. She made her way to the west wing, to the wall just past the elevator bay, where a modest bronze plaque was mounted. The letters read, Brooks Medical Center Excellence in Community Healing. It was a name most passed without thought, but not her. Maya stopped in front of it, her eyes scanning the engraved dedication. Named in honor of Lorraine Brooks, RN. Compassion without compromise. Maya reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the metal, pausing on the last word. Her mother had been a nurse here before her, dismissed in silence decades ago for challenging a racist supervisor. Her termination quietly filed away while the hospital moved forward without ever looking back. Maya had never forgotten. Every procedure, every late night, every second of training had been in pursuit of something greater than vindication. It had been about reclaiming the space that had never welcomed her mother and turning it into something no one could take from her. She stepped back, the reflection of her white coat now mirrored in the polished plaque. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, shoulders squared, as the hallway emptied behind her. It wasn't victory she felt. It was clarity. She hadn't needed Helen's apology. She hadn't needed the hospital's acknowledgement. What she had needed and finally earned was the undeniable truth made visible, that she belonged not because she had proven herself in the face of doubt, but because she never should have had to. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. What part of the story hit you the hardest? Was it the moment Maya stepped in to save the very person who tried to erase her, or the quiet ending that said more than any apology ever could? And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your take.